So we're going to talk about our conflicts, and I'm going to talk about what I'd like are examples of two different kinds of conflicts. One are disagreements in values. So, for example, you think that something ought to be taught one way, and someone else thinks something ought to be taught a different way. The other are sort of conflicts that aren't really about values, but are conversations that are difficult because you have to tell your administrative assistant that they need to start scheduling your meetings so that there aren't three of them at the same time, or your fellow keeps showing up late for rounds and you're not quite sure what to do, or you need to give feedback to you've gotten one of your faculty's gotten a teaching evaluation that says that the house staff would rather round with Attila the Hun, and you need to talk to the faculty about their teaching evaluations, or someone signed up for the medical, the first year course on doctor-patient communication, and she's missed 3 sessions in a row and hasn't told anybody, and you have to sort of give feedback about that. So it's sort of evaluative feedback. And so what I wanted to do was sort of get your ideas about either conflicts or sort of this evaluative feedback issue that sort of keeps you up or sort of makes you feel frustrated.
One that we had recently was, it comes up again and again, is residents who are trying to get discharged perhaps earlier than the attending thinks is wise.
Okay. Okay, so the resident keeps wanting to discharge the patient early. What else? Yeah.
I think you brought up something that I'll just take a step further about how to deal with faculty evaluations, either clinically or in the classroom. And like the major conflict that I have is not just how to deal with it, but what do you do when you know it's not going to work? When you just, in other words, when the conflict cannot be resolved. How do you gracefully tell somebody you don't really want them in your course anymore?
Well, there are two issues there. The first is I would urge you not to decide before the conversation that it can't be resolved. And the question is, what happens if you've had multiple conversations? What happens if you've had multiple conversations? So what if you've had multiple conversations and it's not getting any better? It's not you, it's me. What else?
Differences in emphasis on divisional and departmental missions.
So you're having a problem with your boss who isn't giving you, I'm not saying you, because your boss is really bloody amazing. I'm having trouble with my boss because my boss wants to move people in certain ways because he's worried about clinical stuff, and I want to keep education as a higher priority. How do I talk about my boss about those issues? Okay. What else? Yeah.
Someone, a colleague or a student asks you for a letter of recommendation, and it's clear to you that their perception, how they perceive, is totally different than how they are actually perceived.
So someone asks you for a letter of recommendation, and you could write a letter, but it wouldn't be a recommendation. Okay, perfect. So my goals are to explain why conflicts often arise using a sort of 3-pronged model, and then to provide some practical hints about communicating about conflicts with either peers or employees or bosses. Now, there should be some sort of caveats. One is that I'm not a negotiator. The second is that much of this literature comes from work with James Tolsky, not Asher, although I'm sure that Asher, I could thank him as well, and Tony Bach, yeah, I mean, really. Yeah. And the other is that if you if like me, you sort of sleep through lectures, what I would sort of tell you is that buying these books, which I'll just throw out and you can sort of pass around, but I'd like back, would probably be more useful. It's not like free book time. You go to the library. Would be more helpful than anything else. And what's interesting about these books is all these books are business books. Because if you want to really learn about conflict and negotiation, it's not done in education. It's all done in business because there's a lot at stake in business. I mean, there's real money. And it's almost all about negotiation. Now, as doctors, we have some myths, or as educators, we have myths about conflicts. The first is it's better not to talk about it. What can you do anyway? People are just the way people are. The second myth is that you need to keep feelings out of conflicts because you need to be sort of rational and objective. And I'm going to argue that, in fact, almost all conflicts are about safety, and so are about feelings. And finally, the biggest problem with conflicts is we always assume that we're right. The other person is wrong and they need to change. If they were only a better teacher, if the residents were only willing to keep patients as long as I wanted them kept, if the medical student had just been a better medical student, none of this would be happening. In fact, if you think about conflicts that you have with your significant others, really, who's to blame for most of them? Your significant other. Your conflicts with your children, if your children would be better children, you wouldn't have to talk to them, right? And I'm going to argue that, in fact, most conflicts aren't about blame, they're about contribution, and we ought to think about how we can both change to make it better. So the first question is, should you talk about it? Because some conflicts just probably aren't worth talking about. I mean, if you talked about every time you disagreed with someone, no one would want to spend any time talking to you because there are lots of things you just say, oh, it's just not important enough to sort of talk about this. So how do you decide when you're going to talk to someone about conflict? So what I'd like everyone to do is to pair up in twos. You can just be with the person next to you. And I want you to think about the last time that you had a conflict, that you talked about it. You two can't talk because that would just be wrong.
Among us, or?
No, not among you. I don't even know if... So the last time you had a conflict with your boss or a resident or a fellow that you talked about, and the last time that you didn't talk about it. And how did you decide whether to bring it up or not? Is everyone clear about what I want you to do? I want you to think about the last time you talked about a conflict and the last time you had a conflict and you decided not to talk about it. I'm going to give you about 3 minutes. Could you please pair up, so to speak, and talk to someone? Except for the two of you. Can you talk to her, please? Because otherwise she'll be hurt. Okay, guys, let's come back together. That's been 3 minutes. If you haven't switched, the other person should be talking. Okay, guys, now I really do want you to come back together. If people could come back together. Maybe not. So how did you decide, in the sort of listening to each other, how did you decide whether to talk about the conflict or not? What are the things that sort of struck you as you told your story and listened to the other person's story about how you decided to talk about the conflict?
My perception on listening to her story is what I'm not supposed to think, and I immediately thought the other person's wrong.
Okay. So you talked about it when the other person's wrong?
No. When she told me the story
Yeah.
about the conflict,
Yeah.
my immediate conclusion was the other party is the wrong.
Okay. How did you decide whether to talk about it or not? What I'm trying to figure out is sometimes you didn't talk about it and sometimes you did. What were the factors? Yeah. Yes, I'm sorry, I don't know your name.
That's what I Zsuzsa.
Zsuzsa? Okay.
We actually had similar issues, if
Okay.
you generalize, and I think we both wanted to prevent an ongoing problem, or that's our goal.
So you talked about it if you thought it would affect something downstream.
Yeah.
Okay.
About severity, whatever the conflict was had to reach a threshold. It's like, okay, not so bad, I'll let it roll off my shoulders, and then it finally reached the threshold. So maybe by that point in time, I'm more angry about it, so maybe that's not the right way to go into the conflict.
So one of the worries is if you wait too long. In fact, what you do is you bring all the previous conflicts into this conflict, and the other person says, why is she so mad? This just like happened once, and in your mind it's happened 23 times, but you've never talked about it before. Okay? Other people? Yeah.
The issue that we actually both kind of came up with this too, had the same kind of experience, is that at some point you have to make a decision about whether it's worth going into a conflict resolution.
Mm-hmm.
If you know there's no way this person, my boss, whatever, is going to change, or if you've tried to resolve something 2 or 3 times and you've come to the conclusion that there's no way it's going to be resolved, then it's just not worth your effort to even try, and then you just say you don't talk about it.
So
Either act or don't act.
if you think it's hopeless, or you think they're hopeless, you often don't talk about it. Now, I want to point out that we often don't talk about it when we think it's hopeless, and yet what we're really doing is passing a judgment on the other person, that they're hopeless. So we're not giving them an opportunity to do better. I had this situation with one of my faculty, who I have permission to tell this story, just so you know, who at meetings always makes me crazy because she always has a comment. And I thought that having a conversation about it would be a horrible thing because she'd get all upset. And in fact, we had a conversation about it, and she was like, oh, I have to change that. And so we have spent the last 6 months, and it's gone away. I assumed, given the kind of person that she is, that it would be hopeless. In fact, it wasn't hopeless. I treated it as hopeless because I didn't want to have a difficult conversation. Often the acting out of feelings is this sort of, I'm getting angry, but I'm not going to say anything about it. The problem is that humans aren't very good at hiding their feelings unless you're sort of a top flight poker player. And when you're angry at people, they can usually tell that you're angry at them. And we typically choose the certainty of silence rather than the risk of speaking up. We're worried that bad things will happen if we speak up. The question is, you need to think about, if you're going to talk about it, what do you want? And the problem is, we often talk about the wrong thing. And there's a great acronym from the Crucial Conversation books that talks about this. You can talk about content, process, or relationship. Now, what does that mean? Well, you know those residents who send those patients home too early? The first time it happens, we should talk about the content of what happened with Mr. Smith and how we're going to set up a way that you and I can check in so that that doesn't happen again. When it happens again 2 or 3 times, we should not talk about the individual patients in which it happened. It's no longer about the individual patient. It's about the process that we need to develop because it keeps happening over and over again. Imagine, for another example, imagine a resident keeps coming late to rounds, right? And every time you talk to them, they have a reason. My car broke down, my kid was sick, I had a fight with my girlfriend, the IRS is reclaiming something in my... And every time you talk about why you're late today, you're having the wrong conversation. It's about, given there's so many things going on in your life, what's the process that we're going to agree to that you're going to come on time? We shouldn't talk about why you're late today. I don't give a flying hoot why you're late today. Today's not the issue. The process is the issue. Now, if we've talked about a process and it's still not working, we shouldn't talk about the process. We should talk about our relationship, whether we can continue the way we're continually working. So if I've given you 5 previous evaluations and they're all bad and we talked about a process for your improvement and they haven't improved, we should talk about our relationship of you still teaching in this course. We shouldn't talk about why the student evaluations say you suck. That's an old issue. They still say it. We shouldn't talk about how you're going to improve. We've already talked about that. You haven't done what we said we were going to do. We should talk about, are you still going to be in the course? If you continually coming late after we've set up a plan for you to come on time and you're still late, I need to talk about whether you should be on my service or not. We talk about the wrong things too much of the time because these conversations are high stakes. So we keep going back and having the same conversation about content over and over and over again. And what we say is it never gets better. Because they always have a reason. And we don't care about the reason. We care about the process or we care about the relationship. And so I think we need to think about, if we're going to raise the issue, what the real issue is that we're going to raise. Does that make sense? Because this is like one of the really big points. Yeah.
I think it comes down to when it gets to that level of the R word, I could use another R word, which would be respect. I think when you get to that point, it's really a lack of mutual respect. You know, if you've gone through the content, you've gone through the process, and there's still no net movement.
So it may be respect. That is, I'm assuming what their intent is. Or it may just be consequences. It isn't getting better. I can assume that they still respect me and they want to get better. It just isn't happening. So I need to be clear. And one of the things that psychologists tell us is that when we get into conflicts with people, we assume it's intent. And I'm going to talk about this later. We confuse impact and intent. I never know your intent. Intent is what goes on in your head. I can never tell what goes on in anybody else's head except for my own, and that's just scary enough for me. The point is, I can look at consequences. I can look at behaviors. I can look at outcomes. And I need to think about, what do I want if I'm going to talk about it in these 3 levels? What do I want for me? What do I want for the person I'm talking to? And what do I want for the relationship? So the best book that I would tell that anyone should read is this book by Doug Stone et al. From the Harvard negotiation team called Difficult Conversations. And there's nothing in it about medicine. He talks about, telling your kids that if they keep coming home late, they have a curfew, they're not going to go out the next 4 weeks. He talks about talking to your boss about your priorities because she keeps changing her mind. And he argues that all 3 really difficult conversations are really 3 conversations. The what happened conversation, the feeling conversation, and the identity conversation. And then we make predictable errors that distort our goals. One of the things to remember, and this is probably an important thing to remember when we have conversations and it just happens again, is that our ability to hear is really limited. You'll only remember 3 to 7 things I said. Probably tomorrow morning. That's it. Of this whole talk, you'll remember 3 to 7. Which means that if I've had a talk with a resident and the next day they don't remember everything that I told them, I shouldn't be that surprised. It's just an inefficient way for us to communicate. The real problems are what psychologists would tell us and the decision analysts tell us. We have these we think that everyone thinks like us. So when we say the residents send people home too early, you know what they say about us? We send people home too late. And they only talk to people who agree with their view, and we only talk to people who agree with our view. And so we can't imagine why those residents are being such jerks. If you don't believe it in medicine, believe it in politics. People who watch Fox News don't read the New York Times typically. And people who read the New York Times don't watch Fox News. So the people who watch Fox News can't believe that Obama got elected. Because they watch Fox News, and no one who watches Fox News voted for Obama. And the people who read the New York Times can't believe it was so close. Because why would anyone have voted for Romney? Second, we have this view that we know the truth and that others will perceive it provided they're reasonable and rational. Now, what does that mean if they don't perceive it? They are not reasonable or they are not rational. So if you believe those two things, you think that all you need to do is keep telling people the same thing over and over and over again. Finally, the way we tell people things is we talk about our conclusions. You're not doing a good job. We don't give data. So we don't make sure that our stories, that is our data, how we came to the conclusion, are shared. We assume that the conclusion we have came from data that everybody would have, and so that everyone should just agree with us because we're all working from the same data. Either. Now, there are a couple other problems, which is intent and impact. And so this is, I need you to be in those same pairs. I want one person in the pair to hit the other person in the arm. No, wait a second. It gets better. The other person then gets to hit the person who hit you. I want you to hit them exactly as hard as they hit you. Then I want the first person to do it back, exactly as hard. That's all I want you to do. It's really easy. First person hits second person hits back the same level of hardness that they hit you. Okay? That's it. Huh? What? Now you can hit him back the same level. Hit him back. That's it. This is one of those things, it doesn't involve talking, it just involves hitting. Okay, guys, back. Okay, so here's the question. No. Okay, here's the question. I want you to think about who hit harder. Were the hittings... So if you do this with college students, because all psychology experiments are done with college students, about 80% of the time, the person thinks that the other person hit harder. First. Second, if you do this back and forth 3 or 4 times, what you'll find the first hit, so the first time you hit him, and then after 3 and 4 backs and forth, you'll be hitting him harder. Because what people do is they take a hit, they internalize an impact into it, and they don't hit back the same hard because it's their arm. They hit the back person a little bit harder. And that other person then takes their hit and hits back a little bit harder again. We make an attribution error and confuse intent and impact. That is, if the resident is making me crazy, the resident must be intentionally making me crazy. If that faculty isn't improving the teaching, that faculty in some way is just trying to screw with me, just trying to ruin my course. We confuse the impact the other person's behavior has on us with our attributions of what their intent is. The easiest way for me to get this is I assumed my children, when they were teenagers, spent all of their time trying to ruin my life. They intentionally didn't listen to me. They intentionally didn't clean their room. They were just, now that they're grown up and I talk to them, they had no intent. I mean, they paid so little attention to me. I was such a little part of their mental lives. Now, they made me crazy, but it isn't that they intended to make me crazy. They had no interest in me. I was confusing their behavior and its impact on me with my views of what their mental life was. And typically when we're in conflicts, we assume that the other person who's making us crazy is wrong, and our intents are pure. We're just trying to protect the patients. They are trying to make us crazy and just not listening. Okay? So the final thing that he talks about in this what happened view of the world is blame versus contribution. Stone et al. Argue that blame is really about judging and looking backwards. And what we do is we assume in conflict the other person is wrong, and so we place blame on them. Contribution is about understanding and looks forward, and it's about what's happening between the two of us that isn't working very well, and how can we both work to make it better. So in fact, I don't often talk to my faculty when they do something that annoys me the first time. I wait 3 or 4 times, so then I'm really annoyed. My contribution to the problem is I don't bring it up the first time. And so I let it sort of fester. And so then, when I'm upset, I'm really upset. That's my problem in our conflict. And I need to own my part of making the situation worse, rather than assuming it's all about them. So Stone argues the first conversation is about what happened. The second conversation is about feelings. Emotions act faster than cognition. Emotions shut down cognition. And for most people, mentioning emotions helps calm people down. We can't ignore our emotions. If people are telling you be calm, it's often because they're emotional. And you can try to sort of pretend like you don't have emotions, but what you really should do is try to figure out how you want to deal with your emotions and be aware of your emotions, because your emotions often tell you more about the story that you're telling, whether you're angry or frustrated or sad. And often naming your emotions with the other person can be transparent about what's really at stake. It's also important to recognize their emotions. So one of the things that I did with house staff when I was giving negative feedback a lot is I'd give them some negative feedback and they'd respond how? They'd get upset. Now, I wouldn't want them to get upset, so then I would try to reassure them. Oh, it's really not that bad. You can do better. Wait a second. What's a normal response? If I gave you negative feedback about your job performance, what's a normal response? To be sad. I shouldn't try to reassure them. I can acknowledge, I can see this is upsetting, but I shouldn't try to make it better for them. All I'm doing is I'm undercutting my feedback. I'm basically saying, oh, don't worry about it. It's the fact that you keep discharging those patients and they keep dying, really not that big a deal. I'm sure you're going to be a good doctor. If they get upset, that's okay. In fact, that's normal and good. It means that they cared about the feedback I was getting them. If they get angry, I need to say to myself, have I made the conversation safe? And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. Finally, first conversation is about what happened. Second conversation is about identity. Second conversation is about feelings. Third conversation is about identity. And what does that mean? It means that we all have identities of who we are, what we like, what we do. So for example, what makes a good resident? A good resident makes their attending's job easier, right? But if I'm a resident, a good resident protects my other residents. And so how we sort of think about what our job is and who we are may drive what's really at stake for us. If I'm a research clinician, what counts as being a good research clinician is getting grants. It's not getting good evaluations on my teaching. And so you can tell me my teaching's really not good, and what I say to myself is, well, of course it's not good. I'm not going to spend 30 hours doing this lecture. I only have this amount of time. It doesn't really matter. What counts for my job is whether I get funded or not. And so we need to think a little bit about who we are and how do we see ourselves, because it sets up our frustration and our satisfaction. And so when we're in a conflict with someone, one of the things we ought to ask ourselves is, how are we thinking about our role, and how are they thinking about their role? Do they have the same assumptions that we have about what their role constitutes? Are there other assumptions that are really driving their role that we don't know about? Okay. So I have to tell a faculty member, and I'm going to assume it's for the first time, that his evaluations in my course sucked. The first thing is, I'd argue that you can talk about almost anything if you make sure that you understand how to make it safe for them. And some of that means you do it in a private area. You ask permission. So if I'm going to tell you your evaluations suck, I knock on the door and say, is this a good time? I want to go over the evaluations from my course. Now, why do I do that? It may do it because they're in the middle of three things. And often what we'll do is we'll just walk in and say, I need to talk to you about your evaluations. Well, no, I just found out that my grant got nerfed and my daughter flunked out of college. This is not a good time. This conversation is not going to go well. So ask permission before you have the conversation. Set up a time. You talked about the importance of respect. That is, I can respect someone even though their behavior isn't what I want it to be. I can respect someone even though I disagree, we disagree about the appropriate time to discharge them. I can respect someone even though they keep coming late. In general, they're a good person and they have a problem with timeliness. That's something for us to work on. I need to figure out what our mutual goals are. Because if we don't have mutual goals, we're sort of two ships passing in the night. So the question is, with this faculty person who's getting bad evaluations, what goal could I name that both of us would agree on about this course and his participation in the course? That was an attempt for me to be able to drink something and for you to have a response of, God.
I thought it was a Rubio moment.
Thanks. That would be assuming intention out of behavior. Okay, so is there a way that I can name mutual goals?
Maybe teaching evaluations for promotion.
I'm sorry?
Maybe teaching evaluations, good teaching evaluations for promotion.
Okay. That's a mutual goal. I want to make sure that, I really appreciate you teaching in my course, and I want to sort of sit down and go over the evaluations because I want to help you be as good a teacher as possible. Yeah?
Helping students learn the material as best as possible.
We're both pulmonologists, and this is an important course to help our students so that when they're third years, they understand about breathing. I mean, I don't know very much about it, but I guess it's important, okay?
Bob, I'm sorry, can you backtrack one more? Actually, how do you approach the goals? Like,
I have to think about what are mutual
what are your
goals.
What is, I mean, it's kind of.
No, I need to think.
Now asking them, well, can we sit down and go over your evaluation? And you're like, so what are your goals?
So I wouldn't ask them what their goals are.
Okay.
I would posit what I think are mutual goals that we're both going to agree on. I'm going to give them an attempt to say, really, those aren't mutual goals. If I'm not naming mutual goals, the conversation is less likely to go well. So I'm not saying I should say to you, what are your goals? I am saying that I should say, one of the reasons we're doing these is X. We do these evaluations for a couple reasons. One is we want to help the students make sure they learn the material. Two is this. Does that help?
Well, usually also, one of the reasons people, if you're talking about giving a lecture a topic, it's because they just don't put enough time into preparing. So, I mean, it's hard to develop a goal then to say to the person, I know you're really busy, you don't really have any time to make this better, so let's make time.
So, I'm assuming the reason it's a bad lecture is that they didn't put enough time into it. I have no idea that that's the case. That's a question about their intent or what's going on in their head. I can't judge what's going on in their head. It could be they spent hundreds of hours, and the way that they give lectures is they tell every fact that they know to the students. That's what they think a good lecture is. It could be that they're just horrified that the students didn't like it. That is, we shouldn't assume we know why they didn't do a good job. I'm just sort of naming for you the story, the facts about the story. The interpretation of the story we're going to get to later. But first I start off with the facts, yeah.
But when you say, I wouldn't ask them what their goal is, I am positing a mutual goal, like we all think that these students should learn what it means to breathe. That assumes we think that person wants to be involved in that process, when in fact they don't. This is an onerous part of their job that they need because they want to be in an academic center. They don't want to teach, but they have to. And when you say that, then they maybe say, well, I can't say back, I want no part of that because then they'll kick me out. So doesn't that potentially set you up for imposing that goal on them and having them have that conversation, you thinking we have a mutual goal, them thinking, yep, I'm right.
So I need to make it safe enough that I need to sort of say, this is the safety and the respect. I want to go over the evaluations with you. I think that one of the reasons we do these is that we sort of want to make sure our students are learning and enjoying it. The other thing is, even if we don't like the students' evaluations, because the students' evaluations aren't the be-all and the end-all, there's something that get used for promotion. It may be I'm going to name the promotion issue because that's what I think the real mutual goal is.
Wouldn't you want to see first where the other person values the evaluation, what they think that this evaluation, why is it important for them and why is it not important?
So that's the contrasting. Often what will help is to name what you think they're going to assume. So if I give you bad evaluations, I assume what they're going to say is, oh, those students, they're just, what do they know? And so I'll say, when we go over these, I want to sort of acknowledge that these evaluations are imperfect. And I'm not telling you that your job is to make the students happy. I am pointing out, and I want to give you data about how your evaluations match up against everybody else's. And it seems to have been a consistent pattern, so I want to see if any of this happens to ring true for you. So contrasting is thinking a little bit about what you are worried that their reaction is going to be that isn't accurate. Go ahead and name it, reassure them that that isn't what you mean, and tell them what you do mean. Yeah.
But how do you take into account the hierarchy of the relationship? Where you as a course director or as an attending or as a chair or whatever, you have a goal, whether it's as patient care or to make this course really good. And maybe this person doesn't have that goal. And maybe I'm not going to assume that person doesn't. But that's the goal that I have. And so there's a hierarchy already because I can kick you out of the course if I want to. But I don't want to do that. But how do you kind of build in the hierarchy into these?
So the hierarchy, again, if it's a mutual goal, the hierarchy shouldn't matter. Now the question is, if I have a goal and they don't have a goal, I really don't, this isn't my highest priority. Wouldn't you rather figure that out in the conversation? The question is, how can you make it clear in the story? So now I'm just going to go over the evaluations. Your evaluations, the students say that you come out late, and your slides are confused. This is what they said in the, I'm not going to talk at all. about anything but the facts. I'm not going to give an interpretation about why I think your slides suck. All I'm going to do is describe the facts. And I'm just going to say, did you see these facts the same way I did? Now, yeah?
So what if you get no evaluation back, and that happens where we have no comments to deal with, and we've still got a same,
Or they're even good.
or were there, which is a 7 and no comments.
So wait a second, guys. I have to figure out that it's a conflict. If I have really good comments and bad evaluations, then I'm going to come to you and say, I'm confused. Because when I look at your evaluations, the numbers are really low, and yet the comments are really good. And I'm having trouble putting those two together, and I'm not sure what it means. I wonder if you have any ideas what it means and how we can collect more data. I'm telling the story. Those are the facts of the story. So if I have conflicting data, I name that I have conflicting data. You know, all your evaluations are 4s. Unfortunately, the students don't give any reason for that. In my experience, 4s mean the following thing. I wonder what your read of this is, because it's a little concerning. That is, you end your story with a question to be curious about what their story is. It's the first time I gave this talk, I was a little confused. I was writing a grant and I really didn't have much time to do it this time. Those students, they're just so critical. They don't like anybody. What does the last comment mean? The last comment means that they're getting defensive. And so then the question is, how can I make it safe and bring it back to the stories? The other 2 comments begin to sort of share a story. I hadn't given this talk before. There's just a lot of information they need to know. So you think that what's going on is that when you give all that information, it sort of overwhelms them. Yeah. Can we look at, would it be helpful to see how other people, because other people sort of give a lot of information, maybe not as much as you, would it be helpful to see how they organize their slides or sort of see what their talks look like? You've given me so much to cover that there's no possible way I can cover it all in an hour. No wonder the students are unhappy. I was unhappy with the talk too. Huh. Well, let's look at that. I mean, I don't want to give you too much to cover. And I sort of need, so can we look at what I asked you to cover and compare it to the others and then sort of see if there's a sort of middle ground or what you'd like to cut out or how we can do it? Because it may be, God forbid, that I did give them too much to cover. This could partly be my fault. The question here is we need to figure out what the problem is. Is it a problem that we don't have the same mission? In which case we shouldn't talk about strategy, looking at other people's talks. We need to talk about whether our goals are the same. We need to figure out in this conversation, now that I've started it, what the defect is. And all that means is I just need to describe it. You know, the patients that were discharged, I saw this, this, and this. And so I'm worried about them going home today. Tell me what. You obviously had a different opinion. I want to make sure that we're on the same page. Now, if I've given you 3 evaluations and we've agreed how you're going to do it, we've come up with a plan, we sit down and we have I don't talk about why your evaluations are bad. That isn't the goal anymore. The conversation then is about how you've been doing in enacting the plan that we agreed you would enact. What's happened with that? Because if you did all those things and your evaluations are still bad, it's partly my fault. I gave you a plan that didn't work. We need to go back and come up with a new plan. If you didn't do the plan, we should talk about what happened that interfered with the plan. We shouldn't talk about the fact that your student evaluations are still bad. And this is where you want to brainstorm, and to a large degree, you want their ideas. Your ideas are fine. The problem is that all the motivational interviewing literature and negotiation literature says that if you want other people to change, they'll change more frequently if they come up with the idea and you endorse it or modify it a little, but it's their idea. It's their brain that's doing the work. Finally, you want to commit to evaluation. So if the problem is that all your teaching evaluations have been bad, I need to say, and the way you're going to do it is you're going to change your slides. I'd love to see your slides ahead of time because I'm asking you to do something that you don't normally do. Could you send them to me a week before the lecture? We're reaching an agreement. We made a deal. We now have something new to evaluate. We have new data to collect. The last 2 patients who've gone home have died. It would be really helpful if we talk about everyone before they get discharged and die. It would just make my life easier. So if you could call me, we're going to work on X. That is, the other person needs to have criteria so that they'll know when it's getting better. You have to have criteria so that you'll know it's getting better, and you have to have a timeline. Now, someone is going to say to me, oh, come on. This isn't what ends if the other person is just, they don't really want to change. And I'm going to say, okay. The question is, what have you gained by running through this process? You've gained lots more data. You've gained lots more data about what their behavior is. You've gained lots more data about their willingness to agree to change something, to make promises to you, and then not keep their promises, which tells you much more about them. That is, all you've gotten is more data to come to your conclusions about whether they can continue in the relationship that you have with them. So for people who say, well, the other person won't change, I'll say, that's okay. The other person doesn't have to change. I can build a much stronger case for whatever behaviors I need to enact. If it's my boss, I have much better data about what my boss really cares about. And then I need to make a decision whether I want to have a relationship with that boss or not. And if my boss continues to do the same thing, and we've talked about it, and he agreed to do something different, and then he keeps going back on his word, and I sort of mention that I'm having trouble, because every time I think we've come to an agreement, it changes a week later, and he says, that's just the way I am, he's probably right. That's just the way he is. And so now the question is, what do I want? It's not about content or processes anymore. It's what do I want my relationship to be with my boss? And it may be that I have lots of other reasons for staying in this job. Okay, I shouldn't think that my boss is going to be different. My boss has given me lots of data that he or she's not going to be different. I should stop having these conversations. But I've tried, and I have data, and I know what has worked or not worked. Questions or why won't this work?